Hi guys, Andrew here with headphones.com. Today we're going to take a look at what's in this box. This is a very high-end AMT driver headphone, and I've actually reviewed this headphone in the past, but I'm going to take a look at it for 2022. So let's just take it out of the box and get started here. As we can see, right away we're greeted with a very no-nonsense presentation, and as we take it out of the box, you'll be able to see that we have the... Oh, what the fuck? Hey Taryn.
What?
Have you seen the headphone?
Does it look like you've seen the headphone?
No. Nope, not in there. Nope. No.
He probably doesn't even know it's missing yet. This is the headphone with two Ds, HEDD phone. It's been reviewed plenty of times in the past, but it's time for a modern take on one of the strangest things I've ever held. Now, I tried this headphone years ago at CanJam, and it actually didn't fit on my head at the time. Since then, luckily, they've extended the sides here, and I can wear it now. So, let's start off with build and comfort. This is a massive headphone. It is very heavy. It is very, very, very heavy as it looks. Though that has some ups as well as the downs, which I'm sure are obvious. It is very well built. And though while there are areas in this that I definitely feel like could be improved for comfort, I think as far as just overall sturdiness, this thing is a tank. One of the most tanky headphones that I've ever held. The pads are well thought out, and while the headband could use something like a suspension strap, the padding is reasonably good. It's thick, there's a bit of a divot right here in the middle, so more of the weight rests on the sides. It's clampy, but not too clampy, just enough to hold this thing's incredible weight. And I will admit, I have worn things that are more uncomfortable that weigh less. Between this and my old LCD2 before they had suspension straps, well, I can wear this for longer. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a comfortable headphone, but it's definitely not the worst. It has a reasonable amount of articulation in most directions, though it's a bit more limited than some other offerings like, say, Focals or your average Sennheisers. But I think you could also bludgeon someone with this headphone a lot more effectively. One complaint I do have is about how it's stored. Whenever the headphone is sitting not on your head, the bottoms of these pads do compress together, and if you leave it plugged in, the connectors run into one another. Not exactly a fan of that, so when you're storing it, it does seem to make sense to put it on some sort of stand that's going to space it apart just a little bit. But as strange as the build is, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about the sound. Now, as always, we're going to talk about subjective sound first, and then we're going to look at some frequency response and talk about objective sound. So, on a subjective scale, this is one of the strangest headphones I've listened to in a very, very long time. Not always in a good way and not always in a bad way. This is a folded AMT driver, not something you normally see. It's something like a ribbon, something like a planar, a little bit in between. What you essentially have is this pleated driver in here that can produce quite a bit of air motion. This results in a very, very unique sound. And I'm gonna go on and let you know if you're thinking about this headphone, you should watch all the way until the end when I talk about amplification, because that really makes a big difference in this headphone. It's not super bassy, it's not super bright. If anything, I would say this headphone generally focuses on its mid-range above everything, but the mid-range in itself is, well, not entirely neutral. There's a bit of a warmth to it, but it's not super strong in the sub-bass. But at the same time, there's a bit of a dip somewhere in the upper mids. But we also have areas where the upper mids can be a little bit shouty. The blend leads to something that is very, very good for specific cases in music and not so much for others. If you happen to be a person that relies heavily on vocals, well, this might not be your taste because some vocals sound a bit muted while others sound a bit bright. And they never quite have what I would describe as a supernatural timbre unless it's on a binaural recording. We'll circle back to that last note in just a moment. Instrumental music, however, sounds fantastic in the vast majority of cases. Things like trap, pop, hip hop, not necessarily as much to my taste on this headphone, but things like orchestral, jazz, or anything that has a plucky, fast-hitting, hard-hitting, articulated instrument, something like a brighter bass guitar or drums, really shines on the strengths of the headphone. But that weird timbre always seems to peek its head through at times when you wouldn't expect. Most notably in anything binaurally recorded, or really just recordings that are in an XY microphone configuration, something where you can hear the space, hear the room, and you're not just divided to mono left and right mixes. I imagine that this would also play very well if you're using an amplifier or a DAC system that has some level of crossfeed. Good example track here, if you want to listen to it, Zombie Girl by Adrian Lenker. Not sure if I pronounced that right. That track sounds more lifelike on the headphone than it does on any other headphone. Yet when I switch back to a traditionally mixed jazz piece with vocals, well, it kind of starts to fall apart. And this isn't always the case, but it's back and forth. Now, Apple Music, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, now has Atmos, and Atmos in its own sense has something kind of like crossfeed. I know it's an oversimplification, but the effect still stands, and it makes a lot of recordings sound like binaural recordings on this headphone, and they really come to life. So the things I didn't enjoy as much in it before, things like rap or pop or rock, turned into an entirely different space with this headphone on Atmos, which really gives it kind of a niche use case. It's not going to be a headphone that I recommend for everyone, but for people who like to listen to the soundtracks of movies, like to listen to instrumental music like binaural recordings, or just happen to have access to Atmos, well, it's gonna be great if you can tolerate the weight. Some parts of the treble sound brighter than they measure. Some parts of the treble sound darker than they measure. That's because really, if this thing wasn't smoothed, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's kind of a roller coaster. Not into massive dips or peaks, but just into non-linearity. But surprisingly not in a destructive way, just in a way that affects this strange timbre and gives it its strength with binaural recordings, but also its weakness with traditional recordings. As I'm sure you've guessed with how much I'm talking about binaural recordings and about Atmos, this has fantastic soundstage. Once again, I'll say that word timbre plays a factor in this. The timbre of this headphone works really well with things that have space to the recording. And in those recordings, things really do get quite wide. They're not in your head. But the things that don't play well to its timbre, well, they close in and you get that very center of your brain sound. It's kind of a light switch. You get on or off and nothing in between. But it also means that when it is flipped in the on position, when you are getting that wide staging and that good timbre performance, you really get it. Now, I guess the real question is, does this belong in my collection? And we'll answer that at the end. But next, let's talk about objective sound. Objectively, this is a strange headphone. Now I have two sets of graphs here, one that was taken by Andrew and another one off my personal rig here. I'm gonna do a little bit more talking about the measurements off my rig just because I'm more familiar with it, but Andrew's measurements are also here if you want to compare. Now the blue line here is an average of the headphone's response, the green line is the target, and the red line, well, that's the compensated measurement. So if the red line is flat, then it's flat to my target. My target here is basically an adaptation of Harman, but without the bass shelf for my rig. It's not perfect, there'll be some deviations on it, but you get the general idea. This measures weird, doesn't it? So we get this warmth in the lower mid-range. We get a dip at 300 Hertz, not something that you really hardly ever see. Bass extension is actually pretty good, but because the mid-range is elevated above the bass, it doesn't sound super punchy or deep or powerful. It's definitely there, but it's not going to be a headphone for hardcore bass heads. As a result of this dip in at 300 Hertz, where it goes back up to 1 kilohertz and becomes level with that same level as 300 Hertz again, it sounds a bit forward at 1K, giving it a bit of a shout at times. And though the rest of the treble is relatively neutral with some darker leanings in the upper treble, it doesn't really sound like it has any darker leanings. There are times on certain recordings where vocals can be a bit muffled, but I think that it's due to the recording style and that divot in the mid-range more than anything. There's also recordings though that sound brighter than it's measured. Things like a very plucky or twangy bass guitar really stand out in the highs. Things like harmonica also really stand out in the highs, more so than this headphone generally measures. There are probably people out there where this above 4 kilohertz will match very well to their individual HRTFs. And there will probably also be individuals that it is the polar opposite and they can't stand it. What we have here, objectively, is a deviation from a target that's not extreme, but odd. And you could EQ it to match the target, but I feel like it loses some of the magic in the process. Let's talk about amplification and then my final thoughts on the headphone. As far as amplification is concerned, this thing likes power. Sure, you can put it on things that will get volume out of it, but it really shines a lot more on something like an A90 or ideally a Singzer SA1, a Class A amp that has a decent bit of juice. On that, it really started to shine a lot more than it did on other amps in my collection, even amps that I really love. So if this is something you're considering, I really highly recommend going the Class A route and something that has juice like the Singzer SA1. The topping A90 is also something you can get away with, but I definitely preferred it on Class A. There's also a community of people who seem to like using this on speaker amps, but there's a whole load of risks associated with that, so do your research first. Do that at your own risk if you really want, but I'm not going to advocate for it because I think you get just as good results off the Singzer SA1. And I think this goes without saying, but you're probably not going to be powering this very easily portably, and you're definitely not going to be using it off of a laptop or a cell phone, at least not with good results. And then on the source end of things, well, a lot of people know that I like vinyl. I really did prefer this more with vinyl than anything, especially once again, vinyl binaural recordings is the way to go. And if you go digital, definitely try it with Atmos. And now let's talk about my conclusions on this headphone. It's not a headphone where I'm gonna go out and say everyone should buy this, everyone should have it in their collection, because that's not the case. But it's definitely a headphone that I could see certain people liking a lot more than an Aria, an HG800S, or a similarly priced LCD. It's not the right headphone for everyone, but it is definitely the perfect headphone for someone. And as a result of that, I do like the headphone. It's not something that I would use every day, but honestly, I've really enjoyed having it here and listening to it, and I might have to add one of these to the collection. Head have made something that stands out, something that's unique, something that does sort of break the mold on what we see with a lot of high-end headphones. I definitely think there's some areas in which they can improve upon it, but they have created something cool, something that stands out, and something that I have an appreciation for. Once again, is it the headphone for everyone? No, definitely not. But it might be the perfect headphone for some of you watching. So that is going to wrap this video up. I'm glad to be here on the headphone show today. If you like this video, leave a like down below. Comment letting me know what you think about this thing and other headphones that stand outside of the normal. You can also get active on the forums if you want. They'll be linked in the video description. And that's gonna be it for this one, guys. Stick around, subscribe. I will catch you in the next one. Peace.